time, 4 p.m. EST and about 9 p.m. GMT. So today we're going to talk about cooking up some good CLIL. And this week I have actually been training teachers in Brazil about CLIL. And when I first thought of this, I thought, okay, CLIL. Well, we'll figure out what this acronym means. You may have heard it in the ELT field before. But I thought, CLIL, the problem with acronyms is this. They sound a bit scary, okay? So it's always really good to be able to have something that we can relate to. And one of the things that I think teachers can relate to, or pretty much anyone in general, is cooking, because we love food, don't we? So some of you have probably cooked before, and probably the first time you ever went into the kitchen, it was probably very, very scary. And something about cooking is the more that you're at it and the more experience you get, the better you get. And then you start getting more confident. And that's the same thing with CLIL. So to let you know what CLIL is, it's content and language integrated learning. So it's something like, it's created by, actually it was founded by David Marsh. He's pretty much coined the term CLIL. But there's other things that you may associate it with. There's content-based instruction, bilingual education. So there are many different types of acronyms out there associated with CLIL. But the important part is to remember it's teaching the subject matter, like science, but you do it in English. You can do some of the language, and that's called soft CLIL. But you may do some of it in the native language, but basically you would teach it with a language component as well, like English. It could be history in English, taught in English, or it could also be geography. So it's any content-based instruction, basically. One of the teachers that I trained this week said something really great about CLIL. So she teaches different subject matters. She teaches elementary in Brazil, the elementary level. So she teaches about, her students are from 6 years old to about 10 years old. And she teaches all the subjects. She teaches them math, she teaches them geography, she teaches them history. And the thing that she tells her students is this. When they come into class, she tells them, students, how would you like to save time, and how would you like to take 2 subjects in one class? And her students say, yes, that sounds great, teacher, because then I don't have to do 2 homework, 2 types of homework. I can go home early. And then she has them talking like that, and they say, well, teacher, how do we do this? And she says, you're doing it now, because now you don't have to study math and you don't have to study English. You study math and English at the same time. So I thought that was a brilliant way to kind of introduce this to your students, in case you have to. So what is CLIL to students? So we're going to talk about that. But first of all, David Marsh, the one who coined the term, says, CLIL refers to situations where subjects or parts of subjects are taught through a foreign language with a dual-focused aims. And this is namely the learning of content while or simultaneously learning a foreign language. So how is cooking related to CLIL? And I will get back to the cooking. Well, this is the way I broke it down. Ingredients, recipes, terminology, facilities, techniques, and experimentation. There's usually a video that I show. It's from Mrs. Doubtfire. I'll put it in here and so you can see the YouTube later. But it's the scene in Mrs. Doubtfire where he's cooking. He pretends to be a maid, so he's in disguise. He pretends to be his children's maid because they're divorced and he wants to see his children. So he's pretending to cook and he's trying to follow a recipe. And he ends up burning his shirt, and it's very funny. He tries to put a sauce in, and the whole entire sauce bursts open and falls into the pot, including the bottle. So it's very funny, and it's kind of like that with CLIL, because these are things that you have to follow along with. You usually have a recipe, and I'll break them down a little bit more, but the ingredients. So what are the ingredients? Well, as teachers, we have ingredients. Maybe they're not food, but your ingredients as a cook, you know that your recipe, the way something turns out, isn't usually related. It is related to your technique, but a lot of it is related to your food. The fresh food, if you've ever cooked with organic food, for example, or the fresher from a fish market or straight from the market, then you realize that your food tastes a lot better. All of a sudden, spaghetti bolognese tastes so much better than from a can. If you cook it yourself and you make the sauce and you make the noodles. So this is the same thing with the ingredients. What kind of ingredients do you have? And as a teacher, you can have things like realia or visual aids or videos, technology, games, flashcards, books, demonstrations, brain teasers, interviews, authentic materials, and you're probably thinking, I have a lot more than that. And you're right, you do. You have plenty of more. And what you can do right now, if you would in the chat box, start typing the kind of ingredients that you have. What do you have to teach your kids your content with? You can name some of the tools there. Some of you might say something like online quizzes. How about puppets? Do any of you use any puppets? So these were the ones that I had already listed before. No, I didn't name all the categories. There's so much more. Some people use Twitter. Some people use Facebook. These are all ingredients. Comics, yes, very good. Comics, flashcards, yes, very good. Now you're getting it. Wall magazines, yes. See, I didn't name all of them. Making videos, yes. So there's using YouTube videos, and then there's the difference between making videos, so very good. Posters, word walls. There are so many types of ingredients. I didn't list them all, and I did that on purpose. And then you have your recipes. Well, what are your recipes? Your recipes to your students are your lesson plans, your instructions, your checklists, your rubrics, your projects. These are all ways that the students are learning the content. And recipes are very important. Recipes are important because the way you give instructions can be very, very difficult, and your students might not be able to understand it. So, for example, sometimes, especially, I know in America, but I've traveled to a lot of places, we get things called objectives. And these objectives come from the school, and I know the European Union has them as well. And this is something like your students should be able to classify and analyze rocks or something like that. Let's say for science, okay? While enhancing their listening skills or something like that. That's how it's worded. Now, you tell your student that in the U.S. it is the practice that you're supposed to write this in the board because your students have to know the objectives. Well, your students aren't going to get that. But if you write something like, guess what? Instead of saying label rocks, for example, and this is just one example, I'm going to tell my students, hey students, by the end of this lesson, you will be able to walk around the playground and be able to pick up a rock and name it. You see how much better that sounds to a student? So things like the way we give instructions or objectives and stuff have to be worded in a way that the student understands. Instead of classifying rocks, I'm going to say, you're going to have a rock collection. A very cool rock collection. And then, so with CLIL, you might think, okay, so if you're teaching science, you're teaching history, you're teaching math, and you're teaching it in the language, well, there's going to be a few things your students struggle with. Namely, the teacher has a very tough job because not only does the teacher have to be an expert at the content, not only do they have to know the content, but you have to also know how to teach the language as well, and that's double duty for you. So some of the things your students are going to struggle with are the terminology, and you may notice that in cooking as well. There's a difference between mince it, dice it, and chop it. There's a difference between add a pinch, add a tablespoon. And if you don't know this terminology, blend it, mix it. I mean, there's some very specific terminology in cooking. And if you don't know it, then that could mean the disastrous recipe. It could really mean that. So the same thing with your students. There's something called CALPS, and that's your very difficult academic language. That's what it means. There are things like, for example, you're going to have big words and things like that. And then there's BICS. There's the social language. So your students may not be able to read a journal, for example, an academic journal, and understand it. They probably won't because it's very difficult to do. And then over here with the BICS, they may be very good at that. They may be very outspoken and be able to use, have conversations and stuff. And then you notice in the writing that the writing kind of suffers and stuff. So these are things that they're going to struggle with. They're going to struggle with vocabulary, acronyms, abbreviations, idioms, jargon, all of these kind of things that come with your content matter. So for example, in science, math, you may have things like the quadratic equation. You may have something such as minus, subtract, add, divide. All of these are specific to the language of that content. So then after that, you have your techniques, and we're going to talk about effective ways to teach those. But one of the ways to teach that difficult language are graphic organizers. You can have visual aids, you can have charts, you can have diagrams that really show stages and show difficult concepts for the students to see. Graphic organizers are great for that, to really break down the language. Concept mapping, these kind of things really help with the vocabulary. So the techniques, you have different types of techniques as well. In cooking, you have the same thing. One of my friends who loves to cook was telling me that there's this drip technique he uses for a pasta. And what he does is he takes a syringe and he puts like whatever, some kind of oil or something, and then he has like a bowl underneath of mashed, the veggies for the sauce, and it drips down. And he does this really cool technique to make his food. This is the way he does his food, and he learned it from a famous chef. And there's other kind of things that you have as well, that you do when you learn to cook. You learn so many things: to saute, to boil, to bake, to brulee, to, in Brazil, I'm learning so many things here that they do. And the same thing with teachers. You have a technique. You can do total physical response. You can make it hands-on. You have game-based education, student-centered, unplugged, dogma, cooperative learning, problem-based learning, project-based learning, mobile learning, questioning techniques. You have all these techniques that you use as a teacher, and CLIL is very much like that. It wants you to use good teaching practice, things that you know of. So it's important that we know the best way to teach our topic, what's going to happen, how, experimentation might be really good for one topic, but it may not for another. And there's so many more that you can name as well. And then there's your facilities. After a while, just like me, I don't like to cook in another kitchen. I have my ways of cooking in the kitchen. And one of my friends, I cooked in his kitchen, and I told him, I said, get out of your kitchen. I don't want you to see me cook at all because I'm going to ruin everything. So I have my special facility, and I have the kind of things that I like in my facility. I have things where I want them, so I know it. And it's the same thing with you. Your classroom is your facility. It's very important. You have the things that you want. You have things that you wish you had. Sometimes you look at other kitchens and you say, oh, I really wish I had an ice cream maker, or I don't. So the way you set up your class for your content is very important. Your classroom design is really important. I'm a firm believer in learning stations. And that's something, it does your classroom support experimentation or whatever is the teaching style or instructional style needed and required for your content. And then there's experimentation, and that's very important with cooking. It's important that the students are able to have the room to make errors. So in CLIL, a lot of times they really support project-based learning and problem-based learning, where students have alternative types of assessment, because you're assessing two types of things. You're assessing their skill at the language. Well, actually, you're assessing three things. And then you're assessing their language skills and abilities, their content knowledge, and their language skills within the content. Are they able to communicate in your content? So this is very important too. So they need to be able to do, you can't test for that in a standardized test, okay? It's very difficult to do that. So project-based learning, e-portfolios, observation logs, all of these are very important. So the questioning, having several answers, having the ability to make mistakes and learn from mistakes, having the ability to research and explore, all of these are really, really great for CLIL. So CLIL, a lot of the theorists want to know, how do we learn best? Because it's related to good content teaching. Well, if we think about how we learn best, we know that a lot of that's related to all of this kind of stuff. So it's very involved with TPR and Realia and project-based learning and all of these things that we know are good for learning in general. So then there's technical terms. There's hard versus soft CLIL. Okay, in soft CLIL, some of the language learning is taught with the subject matter. That means that you may be doing a little blend of both. Now, most CLIL would prefer hard CLIL, and that's where you do language and content are both taught at the same time. So it's a bit different than when you go in and you show a diagram and say, we're going to learn the present perfect. You wouldn't do that with CLIL. Instead, you would go and you would do something like, okay, today we're gonna do geography, okay? And with geography, we're going to learn about volcanoes, okay? So we're going to learn about volcanoes, where they're at, and this kind of stuff. And then there's things like lava. We can use the verbs, the active verbs for that. For example, molt, you know, things like that with it. And then we can point out some of the language or the phrases or the grammar or the technicalities later, but it's very much as it comes. As it comes, that's when you point it out. It's not that you teach the language. That's not the focus, that they know that this is a preposition or anything like that. That's not the focus. We're not doing that at the beginning. The content itself and what you're doing within the content is the focus. And then later on, you can point out the language and study things like that as well. Okay, so Olo asks, if I taught them the language before the subject matter, what's that? Okay, that might be PPT, or that just might be that's a lot what PPT does too as well. And I think that's just like teaching grammar as well. If you focus on the grammar and the structure and like phrasal verbs, today we're going to learn about phrasal verbs, and then that's the focus. But with CLIL, the focus would be the actual content, and it's always teaching that content. So if you're, for example, a math teacher teaching in English, but your students speak something else, like Farsi, for example, then that would be CLIL. Okay? Translanguage. Sometimes you do it in both. This is where bilingualism comes. Sometimes you do it in both English and the learner's native tongue. So the teachers that are training this week, some of them would teach because in Brazil they speak Portuguese. So they would learn some in Portuguese, and then they would learn some in English. Okay? So you can have translanguage. I think that's what a lot of schools are doing. CLIL has 4 C's, and this should be in every single lesson, according to CLIL experts, okay? Content, communication, cognition, and culture. Well, what is that? Well, we'll go through that. Content, that's your subject matter. Science, math, history, geography, all of those are contents that you can teach. Drama. The difference between this and ESP is ESP, you don't have to teach all the time, necessarily. But it's a little like ESP. ESP is like English for specific purposes, like if you're teaching lawyers English or something like that. That's a little bit like CLIL too, actually. Okay, so some of the things your students are going to wonder and that you should be able to answer. So think about what you teach right now. Maybe you just teach English right now. But something to answer is, why is your content important to learn? Why is it? Now, my teachers had a very difficult time answering this. They said, teacher, it's very difficult. Well, it is difficult, but this is what your students want to know. They want to know, why is your content important to learn when they're taking a CLIL class? And the other thing they want to know is, why is it important to learn your content matter in English? Why is it important to learn it in English? And as you can tell, I made a mistake there, a grammar error. And if you can answer that, then you've done your students a very, very important service, because that's what they want to know. You've related it to their real life. The other questions that come up with the 4 C's. How do I teach my students to effectively communicate using the content? So if you teach history, how do you teach your students to communicate but learn history as well? Are they going to be able to be fluent in history? Okay, Bob pointed out something very good. Thank you, Bob. He says in ESP, the students have the grammar and general language. So you're teaching their technical language. So Ola, that might also help with the question you asked earlier, as if you taught them the grammar before. So yes, you communicate. Can they communicate using the content? A lot of times that presentations help with that. I always get my students, I used to teach in Texas, I was teaching English language learners, and a lot of that is content-based instruction. Yes, Giselle says modeling. Yes, very good. You can model the way to communicate as well. But it's important that they have like presentations and things like that, projects to do, because this really teaches them about communicating using the content. And these are things they're going to have to do as well. So, for example, if they decide to be engineers, they're going to have to present their diagrams. And the good thing is that that's a skill that's needed for their jobs. If they're able to communicate in both languages and especially know the terminology of their field, then they're going to be very, very powerful kind of employees that companies want. Cognition. Now, this is the hard one. How do you teach learners to grasp difficult concepts while learning the language? Now, this is very taxing on the brain. It's very, very tough to do. And these are things that you can realize as well, that it's tough to do for you as well. Learning a language and then learning science at the same time. Oh, that hurts. So graphic organizers are really good. Experimentation. Make it fun. Make it fun so that way it can give them breaks, but also help them to categorize, to compartmentalize it as well. How do I teach my content in a way that supports my learners' understanding of their own culture and their relationship to other cultures? This is another important part of CLIL. You have to teach culture in every lesson. Well, one of the ways that you can see in the background is I use Skype a lot. I think Skype is a great way to get students to learn about other cultures. You can Skype a guest author. You can Skype an astronaut. You can read an astronaut's tweet. They're tweeting from space, and so it's very exciting. There are different ways you can introduce culture, what other people in the field are doing in the language. So not only what they're doing inside, and you can definitely have guest speakers. You can have some of the parents will actually work in the field, and you can ask the parents, and they will love you, because then they're going to say, oh, I get to speak to the class. And then, of course, one of the most important questions is, how well do you know your content? I think this is really important. So you're going to take a quick survey, and then we're going to end soon after that, but we did start a little late. So, so this is what I want you to think about in your homes right now. We're going to take a survey about your subject matter. So think of anything that you're teaching. If you teach more than one content, then your favorite one. The favorite one that you think you know the most of. Okay, so these are things that I think that are important to know. Okay, first of all, what are 5 current, or something that you're just interested in? You can even pick a previous profession before you were an English language teacher. So what are 5 current jobs related to your content? So if you're a science teacher, what are 5 current jobs related to science? Or if you're an English teacher, what are 5 current jobs related to English? your history teacher, what are 5 current jobs related to history? Okay, so think about that. You can write this on a piece of paper. Number 2, name 2 experts who are still alive. This is related to your field. So if you're doing history, 2 experts who are still alive in your field. These can be authors, speakers, researchers. If you're on Twitter, then this should be easy, because I know for me, it's so easy to follow things in Twitter. Okay, so Ola is putting it in right now. Okay, very good. So if you're teaching business English, yes, then the same thing. Whatever you're teaching, lawyers, aviation. Number 3, name any news that came out recently that has impacted your field. And a good example of this is science. Okay, so in the textbooks, a lot of textbooks are wrong because we don't have 9 planets anymore. One of our planets is no longer a planet, and this would be Pluto. Pluto isn't a planet anymore, so this would be recent news that came out that impacted science. Pluto isn't a planet. They discovered water on Mars. Did you know this? In ELT, there's been some things that have come out as well. Okay, another one. Which of these tasks do you do or have you done? So think about this. Blog about your subject matter or teaching your subject matter in the last year. Wrote an article in the last year. Conducted research in the last 3 years, because research takes a long time to publish. Presented at a conference in the last year. Hosted a workshop in the last year. Hosted a webinar in the last year. And all of these have to be related to your content matter. So if you're thinking of science, then hosted a science workshop or a webinar on science. Ran a club. In the U.S., we have clubs. In other countries, they may not have clubs. But this is like a robotics club. Like if you did a robotics club or a math club or something like that, where the kids can go there after school and you organize it. Wrote a book in the last 3 years. It could be a free ebook as well. Okay. Conducted field research in the last 3 years. Field research means that you're in the field, you're actively involved, like a paleontologist or somebody who collects water samples and then studies the microorganisms in them and then maybe wrote a paper about it. So that's field research. You're in the field doing things. Published research in the last 2 years. Hosted a radio show or podcast in the last year or other. Number 5, what do you do on a regular basis to keep current in your field? So what this is like and how often? Read magazines. Okay, I remember when I was teaching science, I used to read science news all the time. I loved it. Psychology Today, Discovery. I just loved reading National Geographic, different types of magazines. And how often do you do that? Daily, weekly, monthly, yearly? Okay. Listen to podcasts. There's so many great podcasts out there. You can just download it on your MP3 player. I mean, every morning you can attach it and it could work. Yay, the lights came on. Read blogs in your field. Attend webinars in your field. Read newspapers or trade journals in your field. Member of a club or a group. Sometimes we're members of book clubs. Maybe we're members of online forums where we can talk about this. I recently joined an astronomy club in my area. I think it's very interesting. Attend workshops, attend presentations, attend lectures, visit museums or attend events around. Learning this, if we want them to commit to this, then we need to be the models. We need to exhibit that we're really interested in our field and we do it often, even if it's something like read tweets, that would count. And number 6, name other ways you keep updated about your subject matter. And finally, number 7, which of the following activities mentioned in the survey that you don't do would you be willing to do? So that about does it. We're wrapping up now. I know that was a lot to think about and stuff like that, but hopefully you have a better kind of understanding of what CLIL is. and how to have effective CLIL. So CLIL is, as a review, what are the two things that CLIL is interested in? What is the student learning at the same time? You can type this in the chat box. Bye, Thomas. Hopefully you understand. Oh, well, thank you very much. Okay, so it's content and language. Very good. It's content and language. Those of you who are yelling in the screen. And then the other thing is that so you teach it at the same time. And if you have any questions, you're more than